I'm Jen from Patterns by Jen. Today we're going over the January block instructions for the 2019 Monthly Color Challenge. If you haven't heard of the challenge, please go to Patterns by Jen blog, look at the top tabs, and choose 2019 Monthly Color Challenge. That blog post will be updated each month with the new links to the new blocks. Today we're doing the January block. Our color is green. I'm going to share with you tips that I find helpful for making my quilting experience enjoyable. Hopefully you can take the tips that you learn from me, mix them with the tips that you learn from other teachers, and create your own enjoyable quilting experience. That's the best thing about quilting. You can take from many different places and make it all your own. Let's get going. Okay, our first step is going to be pressing. Whenever I press anything, the first thing I do is start with starch. I always use the best press, but you can use whatever you find, and you don't have to use it at all if you don't want to. But a good pressing with your fat quarters, since that's what we're using mostly for our challenge, unless you're doing scraps, a good press is the first step in getting good, accurate cuts. I like to use the mister for my best press. It's a cute little mister that I got from a Quilter's Corner. Just a quick little spray. The mister really saves on the amount of best press that you use, so if you find that it's too expensive or that you use it a lot like I do, a mister is really, I feel, the best way to go for saving money. Just a quick little spray. It does not take much. And I don't worry very much about how I press. This isn't a press only or iron only moment. This is just get that flat and get those creases out of there. Okay, so how do we cut a fat quarter? I tend to fold my fat quarter in half the longest way. I'm going to flip this over. So my short ends go together. I don't worry too much about how it looks up here. You can see it's kind of, I don't know if you can see that, it doesn't really line up very well. I'm not really worried about that. What I'm going to worry about is lining up my fold along, pick any line on your mat along that line and make sure the fold is straight. Then I'm going to give myself a straight edge, and again all I'm going to do is just line up my ruler with one of the lines on the mat just so I can get a nice straight line. Let's see if I can get to show you. Whoa, sorry. I'm just lining it up so my 1/4 inch, this is how it lines up right now, so that the 1/4 inch line matches along the line on the mat. That way it just gives me a good straight cut there. Hopefully these videos come together a little bit more smoothly as I get a little more practice with this. So I'm just going to give myself a quick straight cut. Now I've got a straight edge that I can use my ruler on. The first thing I'm going to cut will be the largest piece that I need. For this one, it's going to be a 5-inch strip. And again, I'm lining my ruler on the ruler along the fabric edge. So you don't want your fabric, you don't want the line of your ruler to be on the edge of the fabric. You want it to actually be right on the line of the fabric. Now that it's lined up and I know that it's right on the line, I'm just going to give a quick cut. Now I know I'm going to need another cut that is a different width. So I'm not going to move my fabric. I'm going to leave it as is, and I'm going to cut my 1.5 inch strip that I need for one of the instructions. So again, this would be hard to see on the camera, but there's a cut line there, and I am lining up my ruler on the fabric alongside that cut, not on the cut, because I want to give myself a little bit extra. Just that extra 1 or 2 threads helps me with my accuracy on my blocks. Once I have those two, I'm going to fold up my extra fabric. I'm going to put aside the smaller cut. We're going to deal with the larger one first. So now I'm going to line up my straight edge along the bottom here and my fold along here. That way I know I'm getting a good straight piece of fabric to work with. I'm going to switch out my long one. You can continue to use the long ruler if you like. I'm going to grab my 12.5 one, though it just gives me a little bit less stuff to have around here. I'm going to again give myself a straight edge to work with, and to do that I'm going to line up my ruler on a line on the mat just to give myself that straight cut. And then I need 2 5-inch squares, so I'm going to line up again on the fabric, not alongside it. On the fabric is my 5-inch mark from my ruler. I'm going to cut that. Now I also need 3 3/8 inch square. So I'm going to open up my 5-inch piece that I have. Again, I'm going to line it up on the straight edge. I'm going to find my 3 3/8 inch mark on my ruler, and again line it up on the edge of the fabric, not alongside it. Get my 3 3/8 inch. Now this isn't square because it was a 5-inch piece, so I'm just going to flip it and again line up the 3 3/8 inch mark on the fabric there, and then I'm going to make sure up here that these lines go along the top so that it isn't I'm not getting a diamond or some weird funky edge or angle on there. You want to make sure you have 2 very straight edges. Trim that off and add that to your pile. Alright, now I'm going to go back to the 1.5 inch strip that I cut earlier. I'm going to again just line it up on the line on the mat. And I'm actually going to switch to another smaller ruler because I just don't like a lot of extra ruler floating around there. I have a hard time with that. So we're going to again give yourself that straight edge. We need a 10.5 inch long strip, and we need 2 of them. So I'm going to keep this folded, and I'm just going to switch to this ruler. You can use your long one if you have a 12.5 inch square, which I have, but I'm not going to take out a 4th ruler. And I'm going to line up my 10.5 mark on the edge of the fabric, not alongside it, on it, making sure that this line follows all the way across the top so that I know that this is a straight, and I'm just going to trim that little edge off. And that is our dark green. Okay, we are ready to cut the light green portion of our January 2019 Monthly Color Challenge block. I have my folded edge lined up along one of the lines on my mat. I'm going to cut one side so I can get a nice straight edge to work with. Again, for this cut, I use the line on my mat, and then from this point on I will use the edge of my fabric as my marker for my ruler. Alright, so again, my first cut is going to be 5 inches. I'm going to line that 5-inch line on top of the fabric, not alongside it. And then for this one, I'm going to do two 2-inch cuts. So I'm going to line my ruler line mark along the cut line of the fabric, not directly on it. I'm going to get 1 and then 2. So you're cutting 2 2-inch strips for the light green. Okay, I'm going to set those 2-inch strips aside for now. I'm going to rotate this one. Again, line up on the bottom line and then line up your fold. Oh, you can't see that, sorry. Line up your fold line on one of the vertical lines. So you know that you have a nice straight piece. I'm going to give myself a straight edge by just trimming off this edge of the strip. Okay, and then I need 2 5-inch blocks. So again, just lining up my 5-inch mark on the fabric, making sure that my ruler markings line up along the top edge or the bottom edge or both, either one, whatever makes you feel more comfortable and confident in your cuts. We have 2 5-inch blocks. Now this one we actually need 2 3 3/8 inch cut. So I'm going to leave my piece folded, find my 3 3/8 inch mark on my ruler and lay that on top of the fabric. I'm going to give this, I'm not going to worry about where this is on the ruler or on the mat as far as where the lines are, because I know these are all straight edges. So I'm just going to line my ruler up now on these edges of the fabric and worry about that. It doesn't matter that this is kind of awkward because this is squared up. And I have 2 3 3/8 inch squares. All right. Next one. This time for the light green we need 2 2-inch strips and we need 4 of them. So again, I'm going to use my 10.5, or sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. First I need my straight edge. Do not forget that because you will be very sad. Alright, so I gave myself my straight edge. I am going to use my 10.5 inch mark on my ruler, line that up on the edge, and cut. And then this one, oh, it came undone. Again, lining it up on the edge of the, or the line of the mat. Give yourself that straight edge. And the 10.5 inch cut. Alright, and we are ready for the next step. Okay, our next step. We need to mark the diagonal on the 2 light green squares. So, to do that, you can use the mechanical pencil. I like these, they give you a nice thin line. You can use the friction pens. I only use these for marking my cutting lines or stitching lines. I do not use them for marking my quilting lines. Or you can use the white marking pen from Clover. This works really well on any of your dark fabrics. Just so you can see the marks I'm making, I'm going to be using my, actually I think my black one is dead, my red friction pen. Alright, line up your ruler so that each corner is here. You got to give yourself a little space because of that marking, the width of the marking pen. And you're just going to draw one little line right down the middle on both of those. These squares are going to be used with the 5-inch dark green to make our half square triangles. To make our square in a square, we have to go back to the 3 3/8 inch light green. I have both of them here. We need to cut this once, not mark it, but cut it. So just make sure that they are, you can do them one at a time if you feel more comfortable that way. If you have them one on top of the other, just make sure they are exactly even all the way around. Again, lining up your ruler from corner to corner. And you have 4 triangles for your square and your square. Let's go sew. Okay, the instructions first call for us to make our half square triangles. I did forget to mention that when you're marking your line on your half square triangles on the light green, make sure you are marking them on the wrong side. Because of the solids I'm using, it doesn't really matter because you can't tell which is right and which is wrong. But for your fabrics, make sure you're drawing those marked lines on the wrong side. So we're going to mark or match a light green to a dark green square. These are your 5-inch squares. And what I'm going to do is, the line I marked is not my stitching line, it's the line I'm going to use as my guide for my 1/4 foot as I'm sewing. So I'm not sewing on it, I'm sewing 1/4 inch away from it. Okay, when I get to the end, I'm not going to lift up my presser foot. I'm going to take my other 2 squares, again putting them right sides together with the light green on top because I want to be able to see that stitching line, or that marked line, that guide line. I'm going to line up my squares, line up your 1/4 inch foot guide on that line, and so a scant 1/4 inch away from that line. I sew these with a medium speed so that I don't get too crazy and out of control. Now I'm going to trim just that. I'm going to leave these sewn together and just turn, line up that guideline on the alongside the 1/4 inch of my foot and follow along that guideline, leaving those squares together still. And as I come up to this square that is still attached, I'm going to stop, just kind of make sure that line is underneath that 1/4 foot mark or 1/4 foot guide, and continue on. Now you don't have to do that. You can cut each one of them apart. The choice is up to you. When you're doing many half square triangles, which I usually do, and I'm sewing 50 at a time, having that continuous flow saves on time and thread. Okay, I've cut those squares apart, and now I'm going to take my ruler and rotary cutter. I'm going to line up my ruler on that line that I drew and cut directly on that line so that I have 2 triangles. Do not cut through the threads that you have sewn on these squares. You're cutting that line that you drew, which you should not have sewn on. You should have been sewing on either side of that. I'm going to do the same for that, for the second one. And I now have 4 half square triangles not yet trimmed. Okay, we're going to press the half square triangles. I tend to like to press these towards the dark side. Make sure you set your seams first with a quick little press, and then you're just going to pull these over, Finger press first if you're afraid that you're going to push them or pull the fabric, and just come over with your iron and press it flat. I like to let them sit for a moment so that they can cool a little. Again, you're going to set the seam, press towards the dark. Some people like to press open. This choice is totally personal, and you do what you are comfortable with and what you like. And sometimes the seams get a little bulky if they're pressed to the side, and people don't like that. Again, this is about finding what you enjoy and what makes it enjoyable for you. All right, let's learn how to trim these. Okay, we are going to trim our half square triangle. My preferred tool is called the Tucker trimmer. I don't know if I can get it in here so you can see it. That's probably upside down. The Tucker trimmer. I sell these in my Etsy shop. The one thing I really like about the Tucker trimmer is the lack of lines. You can find the measurement you need very easily and not have to worry about the 1/4 inch marks or the 1/8 inch marks. I need to trim this to 4.5, and as you can see, here's my 4.5. I don't have to worry about any other lines. I won't go over how to use the Tucker trimmer today because you may have just a regular everyday quilting ruler, which is just fine. That's just fine. They should have a 45-degree angle on it. You need that in order to get these to line up and square up correctly. You can also use, if you don't have a square, you can use your rectangular, either the larger or the smaller, just as has a little bit more you have to maneuver, but that's not a big deal either, or your 12.5 inch square. Anything with a 45-degree line is going to work. So you're going to line up your 45-degree line on the seam that you just sewed and pressed. There's not a lot of wiggle room on mine this time for some reason, but you want to line this up and just trim the least amount on this first trim that you can. You want to have a little bit of wiggle room in case something slips or it isn't matching up on the other side. So you just want the smallest of trims go up the side, and then you're going to just go along the top without moving that ruler. So you're going to cut and cut. Brush those away. You'll notice I have an extra little piece here. There are many extra mats you can buy, smaller, bigger, rotating mats. What I used is I cut up an old mat that had gotten too used, and I use the back of it now. I use that for my trimming when I trim half square triangles, flying geese, 1/4 squares, anything like that. I use this extra little piece. I also use it for when I'm marking my lines on my half square triangles and squares so that I preserve the mat that I'm using for cutting. Alright, so now for the second set of cuts, you're going to line up your 4.5 on that fabric, lining up your diagonal, your 45-degree mark on the diagonal, that seam that you just sewed. Did you see how I rotated it? So let's go back. We made this trim first, here to here, and now I'm just going to turn it this way so that our seam is still going the same way. We've just switched which is up and which is on top and which is on bottom. Line that 4.5 inch line up here. Line the 45-degree mark on that seam. And again, you're going to trim up the side and over the top. And you have a perfectly squared 4.5 inch square, 4.5 inch half square triangle. Alright, let's do that again. Just lining up our 45-degree angle on the seam that we sewed. making sure for this very first cut that our 4.5-inch marks are on the fabric, but we're not making this a 4.5-inch cut. We want to, there should be fabric on either side of these 4.5-inch marks that you are going to later trim. You want to have some extra fabric there. So line those up, making sure there's extra fabric. Line the 45-degree angle, 45-degree mark on the seam, and enough that we can trim off just a little bit here and over there. Okay, then we're going to rotate. Nope, I got a little dog ear, it didn't cut off. We're going to rotate. And now this time we are going to line up our 4.5-inch marks on the fabric along that edge, not alongside it. The 45-degree mark on the seam. Trim the side and the top. Brush those trimmings off and do the next. Again, making sure that we have fabric on either side of the 4.5-inch marks on the rulers for this first cut. And then for the second set of cuts, they're lining up right on that edge. Ooh, sorry about that. I'm not used to having a tripod standing over my cutting area. Okay, my 4.5-inch marks are on that line, and I have 4 perfectly squared half square triangles. Let's move on to the square and a square. Alright, for our square and a square, you need the dark green 3 3/8 inch square, and you need the triangles that you cut from the 2 3 3/8 inch light green squares. You're going to sew these on one triangle at a time. Because we are trimming and these are cut larger, you don't have to match up the middle of the square and the middle of the base of the triangle. A lot of times if you are making a square and a square using exact measurements, you would need to fold up your triangle and find the middle, and then fold up your square and find the middle, and then match those two. Because these are larger and we are trimming them down to size, you don't have to do that. So let's go sew. Okay, we're going to sew our first triangle on. Again, as I talked earlier, you don't have to find the middles. You are going to put the triangle right side together with the right side of the dark square. And we're just going to line up and we're going to sew that edge. And again, because we're trimming this, we don't have to worry about that center. We're going to use the scant 1/4 inch. This triangle will pull a little bit as it gets sewn through, so just make sure the edge stays. Okay. When you have that sewn, we're going to just press towards the triangle. Okay, we have our first triangle sewn, so we're just going to again set that seam, bring that triangle over. You don't want to shove it or push it over, you're just going to kind of lift it over, and then I just when I go this way with my iron, I'm not pressing down, I'm just bringing the fabric over a little bit and then pushing down. Okay, then we'll take this back to the sewing machine. All right, we have our little house. We're going to now add a triangle to the bottom of our house. So we're going to the opposite side of where we sewed the triangle on first. Again, lining up right sides together. And we're just going to sew a scant 1/4 inch along that edge, making sure those edges stay together. Now sometimes if I'm feeling like I don't want to stop and start and stop and start, I will sew one triangle and then flip over to the other side and sew that other triangle before I go press. So I'm going to go do the same thing and just quick press the towards the triangle. Okay, so I have my 2 triangles sewn, and I'm just going to continue sewing these triangles on my square. Now this time you still do not need to worry about centering or matching the centers of your triangle and your square. However, if you look closely, which I can't zoom in any further I'm afraid, but you will get a 1/4 inch seam allowance on either side. So as I'm putting my presser foot down and lining up my needle should match up. Let's see if I can show you. My needle should match up right, whoops, wrong side, sorry, right here on my piece. So I'm going to sew with my needle here, and when it comes out, it should come out pretty much right at that corner. It won't matter if it's exact, because again, we will be trimming these. But that's kind of a good guideline if you want to make sure that you are leaving yourself enough space on either one. Now be careful that you don't pull this seam allowance down. You want to just make sure it stays facing the direction it's supposed to be. Sew that scant 1/4 inch. And I am going to take the lazy route here and sew my other triangle on before I go press. You can do this with the larger square and a square units, because you don't have to worry about, you don't have to worry about catching the tip of the triangle when you're sewing your seam allowance. There's enough space there. So instead of getting up and getting down, which I am a firm believer in having your pressing area away from your sewing machine, so you have to get up and move a little bit, sometimes it's just nice to be able to get as much sewing done before you need to press. All right, let's press. All right, so we're going to press to the triangle still. So set your seam, bring your triangle up, press. Remember, even though it looks like I am pushing when my iron is not all the way down. I'm just kind of moving the fabric over out of my way, but I'm not actually moving it and pressing it. All right, you have your square and a square. Let's trim it. All right, we are going to trim our square and a square. Again, I have a favorite ruler for that, which is called the Square Squared. Again, it's from Deb Tucker and the Studio 180 design. The thing I like about this one is you can find the size of your square that you are trimming to. So this is going to be a 4-inch finished block or unit when we are done with it. So all I have to do is line up in the center, or try to line up, that wasn't very good, line up the 4-inch, and now you can see the 4.5-inch mark is here, and I've got my 1/4-inch seam allowance all the way around it, and I just have to trim. You don't even have to think about it. So it's a nice tool. I really like that one. Makes it much easier. I don't have to think. However, as with anything, you can do it a different way as well. And I'm going to show you how to do this with the, I use the creative grids. They are my favorite just because they have that kind of scratchy feeling on the bottom so that your rulers don't, you know, move over, slide, just when you're making that really important cut. So to trim your square in a square using your regular everyday quilting ruler, the first thing you need to do is make sure that you have a 1/4 inch on either side from that inside square point. If you don't, and you are over here, or you trim it right on that point, now your seam allowance is here, you've lost your point. So you want to make sure on both the side and the top that you have a 1/4 inch seam allowance for sewing. The next important step is to make sure that your 4.5 inch line has that extra fabric all the way around, so that you will have extra to trim off here as well. And there should be, your line should have plenty of space here. You shouldn't have to worry about your 1/4 inch. You're just going to worry about the 1/4 inch seam allowance here on the side and on the top, and then make sure you have extra fabric for trimming over here. And one last thing I like to do is make sure that this looks like it's going right through the middle. You can, if you want, line up your 45° on a line here, but this way I get to make 2 quick cuts and be done with it. As long as this is splitting this right down the middle, and you've got this coming, this little white X right down on the middle, you are good to go. So a 1/4 inch seam allowance, you're cutting, and then the extra fabric. And take those pieces away, and you can see there's a good 1/4 inch there for me to sew and not lose my point. Alright, I'm going to rotate it just like I did the half square triangles. I'm going to again make sure I have a 1/4 inch on my space from each point, and then I'm going to line up this time my 4.5 inch line on the ruler on the edge of that fabric, and we're just going to trim the side and the top, and you now have a 4.5 inch square to square, which will finish to 4 inches and should match up with your 4.5 inch half square triangle. Next up, we're going to be sewing our strip piecing and trimming those down for our block units. Okay, we are going to sew our green, dark green, and light green strips together. You'll notice they are different widths. It doesn't matter if you sew the dark on top or the light on top, just make sure they are right sides together. There is a close-up video of how to sew the scant 1/4 inch on the Quilt and Learn with Patterns by Jen Facebook group. We're going to just sew along the long side of the strips all the way down, making sure to keep that scant 1/4 inch. By scant, I mean that on this side, which you cannot see from your view right there, I do not see fabric on this side of my 1/4 inch foot. It is all the way underneath, just a hair, so it's not all the way in, but just a hair, so I can't see it on this side, and that's giving me my scant 1/4 inch when I'm using my 1/4 inch foot. I'm going to go ahead and sew the second strip as well here. When I do chain piecing like this, I like to make sure that I am sewing the exact same way every time. So my dark was on the bottom with the first piece, it's going to be on the bottom with the second one as well. Again, making sure that as you are sewing these that the fabric isn't being pulled away and that the edges line up the entire time. If you need to slow down, slow down. The most important part and trick to getting these the correct width when we're putting them into our blocks is that this seam is accurate, that it isn't wavy, and that those edges stay straight. So if that means you have to slow down to start with, then slow down. There's no race. This isn't about who finishes first. This is about making sure you are getting your accurate seams and so that you can get your accurate cuts. These shouldn't kind of wave back and forth because you sewed as fast as you possibly can. This isn't pedal to the metal, Margaret. This is slow and steady. So let's go press these quick. Okay, we are going to press. We're going to press to the dark. So again, set that seam, and then with strip piecing, I have found that if I can finger press first, that I lose that wavy strip. If you have noticed that your strips kind of curve in, that means when you are using your iron, you are pushing that fabric around. And you don't want to do that. That is really harming how your strip piecing is coming out. So first finger press over, and then come with the iron and give it a good hot press in place. Again, we're just quick setting that seam, pressing with our fingers to get that over so we're not pushing with our iron, and getting that U. And now we have this gorgeous straight strip. Let's go put the next strip on. Alright, we are ready for the next part of our strip piecing. One of the tips that was shared with me a few years ago from Tracy, one of the co-owners at Fabrics Plus, which is my local quilt shop. There you go, ladies, a free plug right there. Was when you are sewing your strips, when you're strip piecing, to make sure that you are, the next row that you sew is going the opposite direction of the first row you sewed. This is again to keep that waviness from happening. So this first seam, if you remember, I sewed with the dark on top, which means my seam, I was sewing this way. And so when I sew this next one, I want to be sewing the opposite way. So I want to be going this way. So I flip this over, which means my dark green is on the bottom again. Now, if you forget and you have sewn it the same way, do you need to rip it out? Not at all. Just know that you need to be a little bit careful when you are doing your pressing, that you are making sure not to pull it or anything else to add a little extra. Now, if these strips, if I needed these strips to be the exact same at the beginning and the end, I would put a little pin right here so that as I was sewing, the fabric wasn't getting pulled. Because I know I'm going to trim these, that these are going to be different size units, then I'm not worried about if these ends come to the same ending. If one's a little bit longer and the other is shorter, it does not matter in this instance. Now I'm using the medium speed on my sewing machine, but before I got comfortable sewing strips, I was down on my slowest speed. So if you can change, you go ahead and change it. If you can't, then you do have to kind of mess with your pedal a little bit and how you are, how hard you're stepping on it and how fast you're sewing. But once you figure that out, I think you will find it much more enjoyable to sew these seam or these strip pieces, and not so frustrating because they come out wonky at the end. Okay, we're going to do our last press. I don't know if you can see that this did not end at the same length. And again, that is okay because we're going to be trimming these off. So, still pressing towards the dark. I'm just going to set that seam. Still finger pressing, even though the first one has been set and pressed. I'm still going to finger press this one. And again, just hit it with the hot, heavy iron then. And you see that you have a nice straight strip. Do the same with this one. Now, does it matter in this instance if you have pressed it differently, not hitting the dark, towards the dark or towards the light? Not in this instance. These blocks are not, it doesn't matter if these seams are going to match up, but many times it does. So if your designer has put in pressing arrows, you want to follow those because they have been tested and we know that they need to be pressed this way. If you're pressing your seams open, ignore all of that. Let's go trim these. Okay, we are going to trim the strip piecing units that we just made. We are going to trim these to 4.5 inch squares. So many of you had issues where it wasn't quite wide enough, and I want to show you that mine actually for this time ended up, I don't know if you can see that, a little bit short as well. So, and I'm not going to worry about that, and I'll show you how to get these to get to be the right width, because part of that is this extra little fabric that we have going on here. You can see it kind of pulls the fabric in this way. Once you put this to another unit and get it stretched out a little bit, we're not stretching. This is fabric matching fabric. We'll be fine. So I'm not going to worry about that. What I am going to do now is give myself a straight edge. But to do that, I'm trimming off this side. I'm going to move this a little bit. Okay. So I'm not worried about the lines on my mat. I am worried about the seams. One of the reasons it's so important to have these seams nice and straight, which is why I finger press them, is because I use these seams as my straight line so that I can cut my straight edge. So these lines all need to follow these two seams along in the middle here. And we're just trimming off a teeny tiny little amount. Nothing. 1/8 of an inch at the most. But you can see, let's see if I can show you, that it is definitely thicker here than it is down here. Whoops. Thicker here than it is down on this end. So it needed to be trimmed in order to give us a nice straight edge to work with. Alright, so then I flip it over so that my straight edge is now on this side, which is where I need the straight edge for my cutting. I'm going to line up that 4.5 inch line again right on the fabric along that edge, right on the edge, not alongside it. We want the line on the fabric. We're also going to make sure that our lines are straight on those seams. Trim the first one. This should still be a good straight edge, but if you are doing strip piecing and say this was 20 inches long and I was cutting 2.5 inch or 2 inch increments, sometimes it does tend to get off. So don't be afraid to flip it over, do a little trim to give yourself a straight edge again, flip it back and start over again. You don't want your pieces to go wonky on you. Alright, so 4.5 and cut. Now the reason I didn't do the longer strips is because we are trying to use, sorry, I want to go this way. We are trying to use up our scraps, and not all of our scraps are 20 inches long. So a shorter strip is helpful in, for you, I think, I hope, in finding the pieces that you need for this size. So I'm going to trim this off. I don't know if you noticed, but this strip I missed cutting the selvage off. I don't know if you can see that right there in that dark green. I missed the selvage. I'm not worried about that in this instance because I know I have extra that's not going to be used in my blocks, and I am not above keeping a little bit of that selvage in my seam allowance. If I know I'm gonna, if I know it's gonna be in the seam allowance, then I will leave it and not go back and recut, because if it's hidden, then I've saved myself a little fabric. So there are quilts and you can't see it. And why can't you see it? Because it's been quilted. So there are many of my quilts that have a little bit of that selvage in the seam allowances, in every quilt, I'm sure, that I've made. But we're not going to worry about that. All right, 4 strip piece units. Remember again, they were not fully, that first one, I didn't even check the second one, that first one was not 4.5 inches. So, and I'm not going to worry about that. We'll lay out our block next, and I will show you how we're going to sew those so that it doesn't matter that they're a little bit smaller. Okay, I have laid out all of the units for our block. And when I sew these, you can sew them however makes it easiest for you. So if you get confused when you fold them all together and bring them all over the sewing machine, do it one at a time. We want to rip as little as possible. So when I do it, I always take my middle and flip, and because I do this every time, it's just kind of a habit. So I just know I'm going to flip all the middle, and I know that when I pick these up, that this is the seam I need to sew. Okay, so I won't do that now for you, but if that's just kind of one of the things that I do to help save time as I put these together. Usually these blocks will take me about an hour. Depends on the block, depends on how many little pieces there are and that kind of thing. But those little things where you just keep that chain piecing going really helps speed things up for you. Again, we're not about speed at this time, we are about accuracy, but one of those tips that of how I put my blocks together. So we're going to go sew this strip piece unit to our half square triangle, and I'll show you how those edges are actually going to meet up just fine. Alright, we are going to sew this first row unit piece together. We have our strip piece unit and our half square triangle unit. The half square triangle unit is a little bit bigger. We know that because when I was trimming the strip piece unit, it didn't quite match up. But if you see how when I put end to end, not really sure, end to end, and how that kind of opens that part up a little bit. Can you see? I can't really tell, I'm sorry if you can see that or not, but that's going to keep that unit equal to the half square triangle unit. But to make sure that that happens, this end, which is the bottom end, I'm going to pin so that I know that those two edges, those two corners, stay together. Again, we're sewing with that scant 1/4 inch. Now, many people like to start sewing from the other side because you have this seam allowance from the half square triangle up in this corner. But if I do that, then I'm kind of messing with this. I want the half square triangle on bottom because it is larger, and I want the feed dogs to pull that bottom piece through more than the 1/4 foot pulls my top fabric through, so that they will be even. So I'm going to just deal with having that extra seam allowance there, and to do that I'm going to take the threads that are coming from my needle and my bobbin. I'm going to start, and I'm going to keep these pulled, and you see that back this way, and I'm even going to use them to kind of pull that fabric through. That way it's not getting pulled down caught into the bobbin area or stuck under the needle. Once that is there, I'm going to keep this taut so that this top part is again pulled alongside. Now you don't do this if this is a 1/4 inch off. If your unit is a 1/4 inch off, you need to resew. But this is just a little bit. It wasn't even 1/8 of an inch, if you could see that. So we're just going to keep it pulled because I do believe that it was the extra fold of the fabric that was messing with the width of my strip piece unit. Now as I come to this part, I'm going to just lift my foot, make sure it isn't pulling that over too much, and make sure that seam stays down. When you get to the pin, please pull it out so you don't run over it. And if you can see, it is edge to edge. We're good. Alright, I'm going to grab the square and a square and the strip unit that goes with that. Okay, we are going to sew the strip piece unit and the square and square unit this time. Now, even though I said on the last one that we wanted the larger piece on the bottom, with the square and the square, I really want this point on top so I can see where it is. I don't want to lose that point. Now, it should be okay because I trimmed it using that, making sure I had that 1/4 inch square, or that 1/4 inch seam allowance, but I still want to make sure. I don't want to lose my point. If you lose your points, it's not a big deal. Nobody's going to notice. And if they are noticing it and pointing it out to you, you need to tell them to go away. This isn't about perfection. This is about the journey. And I truly believe that. So I do post those times where I mess up and the mistakes I make, like not trimming off the selvage and the strip piecing, and that my strip piece units were actually a little small. It happens to everybody, and it isn't about being perfect. It's about just enjoying where you're at. And each time you make a square and a square block, and each time you trim up a half square triangle, you get that much better. There's a little thing that I saw on Facebook, of course, because that's where we find everything these days, that says if you had started 2 weeks ago, you would already be 2 weeks better. So, do we worry about perfection? No, we are just going to worry about continuing our practicing. You can see I didn't lose my point. Our big thing in our household is practice makes better. We're not looking for perfection. Perfection is overrated. So, practice makes better. All right, let's keep sewing these block units. Okay, I'm ready to start sewing the left and middle block of the bottom row. So again, it's the half square triangle unit and the strip piece unit. My half square triangle unit is on the bottom, which means that as we get to the bottom edge this time, that's where our seam allowance is going to be, and it's flipped up. So we'll have to be careful about what way that seam is pointing when we get to that point. Again, just using the scant seam allowance, you want to make sure your edges are lined up as you sew. We're going to carefully lift up our presser foot and go slow to make sure we don't flip that seam allowance over. Now as I get down here, I want to make sure I can feel that this seam allowance is up this way. If you hold it up here, I have found that that actually helps keep it from flipping underneath here. It just, because you're catching it with the presser foot up higher. But you just want to go slow, and if it flips, you can either rip out those last few stitches and re-sew, or you can leave it and not tell anybody. Alright, we are going to press the first seams that we've sewn for our blocks. If you remember, I go from top to middle to bottom. And with these instructions, we are pressing everything towards the strip pieced unit. So that's hopefully easier for you to remember on which way you're pressing, and you don't have to go back to the instructions all the time. But as always, if you have questions and you're questioning what you're doing, stop and go back to the instructions. I'm going to flip it over, finger press, because I'm just kind of partial to doing that these days. And get a nice flat seam, and you'll see both edges are exact. Now with our square and a square, we're going to have a little extra there, but it should all fold over this way and not be a problem. And our last one. Again, setting that seam. Setting that seam just means that the heat is kind of shrinking those threads just a little bit so that they stay in place. All right, we're going to do the rest of the block units. Okay, so this time I did bring all 3 rows with me. So I have my top row, my middle row, and my bottom row. And all I did was flip over that right block, or unit, sorry, over onto the piece that needs to be sewn on. And then I went from top to middle to bottom. And I do that every single time, and I do it top, middle, bottom every single time. So, and it just becomes a habit for you. And when it's a habit like that, then you tend to have less mistakes. Now, I still want my half square triangle to be on the bottom. So I'm going to flip this over, line up those sides, and pin that bottom edge. It's important to also have your top fabric edges lined up as well before you start sewing. If you aren't watching that, then you can have issues as well when you are trying to get your units to line up exactly. And I'm going to feel that seam and make sure it stays up. Take my pin out before it gets run over. Okay, and then I'm going to leave that there because I'm going to do some chain piecing here. Again, this time it's my square and a square, and I want that on top so I can watch that point. I lift up my presser foot when I get to those edges of those seam allowance so that I'm not catching them as I go over them. That way they stay flat when I am, to make it easier for pressing, but also for quilting, and you don't have that added bulk because it was flipped over. Ooh, that pin is bad. Let's get a different one. Again, it's just as important to match up these first edges at the top. That time when I had the seam at the top, I could use, because I was chain piecing, I could use this back piece to kind of pull it through nicely. My edges didn't line up very well there, so we're just pull that over and sew that, and our rows are done. We will press towards the stripped units and then sew our rows together. Okay, I have the rows pieced and pressed, and now we're just going to turn this one down, pin here, and I'm going to pin at the end as well because we are wanting to still match up this stripped piece unit. So we'll do this one and then we will press and then we'll sew the bottom. Okay, we're going to pin these up quick. Because you pressed towards the strip piece units in each row, your seams should face opposite directions. So here's the seam on this one, here's the seam on that one. And what you're going to do is just kind of wiggle those together until each seam, you can feel that that's locked in place. And then I put a pin coming in here, let's see if you can see that, coming in this side and coming out on the opposite side. Can you see that? I'll do that with the next one. And the same thing, putting my pin on the right, coming out on the opposite side of that seam allowance right there. And then I'm going to pin this one as well. And we're going to change that. Okay, we're going to change that up. I'm actually going to flip it this way because I want those half square triangles on the bottom. And I did not do that. And I want my square and a square on top. So we're just going to switch that. Still pinning the exact same, but because of the way the machine pulls the fabric through and the side that the thread is sewing on and all of that, it affects the pins going. It works better if your pins are going this way. Had I not switched it, they would have been going the opposite way. And for whatever reason, that just makes it easier to pull them when you get up close and keep the fabric moving evenly through. Alright, so now I'm going to pin this edge now that we've got that corrected. So I want to sew with the half square triangles on the bottom because the strip units are just a little bit smaller. Plus I want my square and a square on top so I can watch that, where that point is and where that seam allowance is. Okay, and making sure that my fabric edges are exact at the top as well. And there is that extra fabric, so I'm going to use my threads to kind of help pull that through. Make sure that your fabric edges are lined up. Now you want to see how that seam allowance wants to flip up. You want to make sure you stop and get that going the right direction. Now as I come here, the seam on the bottom is going the correct direction, so I just want to watch that this seam doesn't get flipped. Now it's pinned in place, but I'm going to leave my pin here until, and you probably won't be able to see this, but I go until I'm on, my needle is right here on this side of the seam allowance, because now I know that that's locked in place. Then I pull my pin. Okay, and then making sure that my edges are still lined up here, I'm going to keep sewing. Watch that point. Now, the seam allowance on the bottom on this side is actually going the opposite direction, so it could be pulled and flipped under here. So I want to make sure I'm holding it down and I can feel that it is not flipped the wrong way. one stitch over the seam allowance, and then I can pull my pin out, and then I want to pull this taut again. All right, and we're gonna go press. Okay, pressing instructions have us pressing this seam towards the top. Again, if you want to press open or press it a different way, that's fine. This is your block. The reason I choose to press up is because we have this extra fabric here from the square and a square. And if you're trying to press it this way or even open, you get a little bump there. Sometimes that just has to happen because of the way the seams have to lie, but if I have a choice, I'm going to be pressing away from that extra fabric so that it can lay flat. And I'm just going to set that and press this. And you can see, try and get this up for you, I've got a 1/4 inch from where that point is for the half square triangle. That means I won't lose that point. So again, that's something we want to work towards, but I lose points just like everybody else, so it's not something to lose sleep over. Although I have to admit I've had to learn to let that go a little bit and be a little bit more gentle with myself. All right, we're going to, add that bottom row. All right, before you pin, I do like to make sure that I lay my block out one last time so I don't end up sewing it to the wrong end or sewing it incorrectly and then you have to rip. So you want to lay it out one more time. Remember, we want the square and a square on top and the half square triangles on bottom. So I'm going to pull it down this way and pin those seams. Remember, they should just nest right together and kind of lock in there. We're so close to being done, you guys. Can you believe it? And you will be done with January and ready for February, which is right around the corner now. All right, make sure you pin this last edge as well, this bottom edge. All right, let's sew that last seam. I kind of pulled on that was that one didn't want to lay flat on the bottom and that edge wanted to kind of curl under, so it's fabric, so you can manipulate it a little bit, make it do what you want it to do to a point. Too much stretching and manipulating gives you a wonky block, and sometimes wonky is okay, sometimes it's not. In this case, we really aren't looking for wonky. One last press. Okay, we are going to press this last seam. Again, we are going away from that center row, away from that square in a square, so we can stay away from that bulky seam allowance right there in the middle. Oh, I don't know what happened there. Well, that one didn't end up pretty, but that is okay, because then you can see perfection is overrated, right? I don't know what that did. All right. We have our January Churn Dash is the name of this traditional block. January Color Challenge block is done. Thank you for joining me. I hope some of the tips that I shared with you, I hope you find them helpful. If you have questions, please ask them. And if you have other tips, feel free to put those in the comments and share them, because we are all learning together, and your tip might be the one tip that really opens it up for a beginner quilter. Thank you very much for joining me. Happy stitching!